The power of prayer. When we encounter challenges that seem insurmountable, we are to pray and ask God for His power to do what is right. Here's Gene.
Most of the situations that we face that are challenges, well, those situations are not a matter of life and death. But in terms of the situation we have here with Daniel and his three friends, it's a matter of life and death. And the setting basically is this. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, or he had dreams, actually. And these dreams troubled him. In fact, it kept him awake, I think, which was probably part of his irritability because he couldn't sleep. But he had one particular dream that really bothered him. Lots of anxiety over it. So he called for all of his wise men, his mediums, his sorcerers, and he did something that was very unusual. He said, "Tell me the dream and tell me the interpretation." And of course, all of these individuals said, "Well, tell us the dream." And he said, "No, you tell me the dream. And if you can't, I'm going to destroy all of you." Now, he was a hothead, but they must have done something that really ticked him off. Because later on he said, "Look, you're just trying to get time. Tell me the dream and the interpretation, or your homes are going to become a garbage dump and you're going to lose your lives." Well, they said to him, "This king, this is impossible. Only the gods know, and they don't dwell with humans." Now, that was a very significant statement from these men. Only the gods know, they said, and they don't dwell among us. Well, because of their response, we see Nebuchadnezzar responding in a way that's just is not human, really. And notice in Daniel chapter 2, verses 12 and 13. Because of this, the king became violently angry. And when it says violently angry, I mean this is violence. And he gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. I mean, he's going to take out all of these guys. I don't know how many there were, but obviously a lot of them. I mean, this was going to be a huge slaughter. The decree was issued that the wise men were to be executed, and they searched for Daniel and his friends to execute them, which means that Daniel and his three friends had emerged as very, very well-known men in relationship to wisdom. Well, obviously, this created a serious problem. Now, again, remember, at this point in time, these men are only 17 years old. They're still in the training program because the training program was a 3-year training program. And yet they had emerged as being very wise, as we've seen, and very well known even to the king. And notice that Daniel had built some great relationships because notice his wise response. Then Daniel responded with tact and discretion to Arioch, the commander of the king's guard, who had gone out to execute the wise men of Babylon. Now, basically, here's a 17-year-old young man coming up to this guy who is going to take his life. And he asks him, he approaches him. And the interesting thing is, he responds, he listens, which means there's a relationship here. This man is just carrying out the order. He's probably not very happy to have to do it, but if he doesn't, it means his life. So he asked Arioch, the king's officer, "Why is the decree from the king so harsh?" Now that's a very straightforward question to a man who's ready to take your life. But the amazing thing, as I said, this man respected this young man because if he hadn't, he wouldn't have listened. And notice what he said. Then Arioch explained the situation to Daniel. He took time to explain this whole deal and the incredible, irrational situation. So Daniel went and asked the king to give him some time so that he could give the king the interpretation. A 17-year-old just doesn't walk into the king's presence, which demonstrates that he already has a bridge to this king. The king knew who he was. He knew who the three friends were. And of course that makes sense because they were demonstrating more wisdom, more physical prowess, more mental prowess, because they were just eating this simple diet the king didn't know anything about, but he knew that they were way ahead of all the other young men. So there was a relationship there that Daniel had built, even with the king. Notice what happened. Then Daniel went to his house. In other words, the king said, okay, take your time, but it's going to happen. For some reason, he had a relationship with the king to the point where the king backed off of his anger and gave him some time. Then Daniel went to his house, told his friends Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah about the matter, urging them. In other words, this is serious. This is serious. Not only are we going to lose our lives if the king doesn't change his mind, but all the wise men of Babylon. Urging them to ask the God of heaven for mercy concerning this mystery, so Daniel and his friends would not be killed with the rest of Babylon's wise men. In other words, they went to prayer. And that's a great lesson in itself, isn't it? And the lesson basically, this great truth is when believers pray in the will of God with the right motives, it makes a difference. And even though God, in his sovereign omniscience, already knows the future, yet he answers prayer, which is a part of that great mystery, again, of God's sovereignty and man's responsibility. Prayer is a great mystery. But the fact is, it works. And we are to pray in difficult situations. And when we go to the New Testament, we're told to pray. For example, we're to be faithful in prayer. 1 Thessalonians, pray constantly. That doesn't mean we are praying day and night with formal prayer. What it means is be regular. Make it a part of your life to pray. It's very important. And I've tried to do that more and more as in my Christian life, to take some time during the day to literally write out prayers. When I write them out, it's very significant for me. I have to focus. Pray constantly. Give thanks in everything, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. We need to take that seriously. 1 John, we read, praying in God's will. Now this is the confidence we have before him. Whenever we ask anything according to his will, and that's a very key phrase in relationship to prayer. Praying according to his will. When we do, John says, he hears us. And if we know that he hears whatever we ask, we know that we have what we have asked him for. In other words, praying in God's will. And Daniel and his three friends are praying in God's will. Here's another statement. This one comes from James. Praying with the right motives. You do not have because you do not ask. In other words, what he's saying is if you don't ask God, you won't receive. In other words, that's important. God welcomes that. But he goes on to say, you ask and don't receive because you ask with wrong motives, so that you may spend it on your evil desires. In other words, he's saying God doesn't answer prayers that are based upon selfish motives. But he answers and responds to prayer that is based on right motives. So we have these wonderful statements, wonderful exhortations, wonderful promises. And basically, they really state that prayer makes a difference in the heart of a sovereign God. And again, we come to that great antinomy. How do we reconcile the fact that God knows what we're going to ask? He knows how he's going to respond. And yet we are to pray, and prayer literally makes a difference with the sovereign God. Here's a question for application, for reflection, and for response on our parts. In what ways have you seen God answer prayer when you faced what seemed to be an insurmountable challenge? Well, most of us don't face the challenges that Daniel and his 3 friends faced, a matter of life and death. But we do face challenges, and I was reflecting on this. And one of the things came to me, I wish I had more stories to tell in relationship to seeking God's will and answers to prayer, but I do remember some. They weren't a matter of, they didn't involve life or death. But I remember one time I flew to Sao Paulo, Brazil. I was invited to speak at the Word of Life Bible Institute that was located about 40 miles west of Sao Paulo. Landed in this big city, 10 million plus people, on a sunny morning, 5 o'clock, and someone was supposed to be there to meet me. Well, I found out later the letter that I had sent, and we didn't have email way back then, but the letter I had sent never arrived. In fact, 6 months after I got back to the States, it came back to me unopened. But the fact is that no one was there to meet me. What am I going to do Sunday morning, 5 o'clock, in Sao Paulo, Brazil, in the airport? I looked up the Word of Life offices that were located in Sao Paulo, but they were closed. I had no way to get in contact with anyone. I thought, wow, I'm stuck here for 24 hours. And then I thought, well, I remembered that I heard a man by the name of Carlos who came to the United States, spoke at Moody Bible Institute. He was an architect. And he spoke in chapel. And it went through my mind, Carlos the architect. So I went over to the very counter and I said, does anyone speak English? One guy said, yeah, I speak English. I said, this is a crazy question, but do you know someone in Sao Paulo, Brazil by the name of Carlos the architect? Now that's like going to New York City and saying, do you know someone by the name of Bill who's an architect? And to my amazement, this young man came back and said, I know Carlos. He's in my church. And he picked up the phone and he called Carlos. In about an hour, Carlos picked me up at the airport, took me to his beautiful apartment, and that afternoon drove me all the way to Anabaya, 40 miles. And I showed up at the door, and you should have seen their eyes get big when I stood at that door because they didn't even know I was coming because they didn't get the letter. And I remember that I did some praying before that. Now, to me, that was a significant answer to prayer. I had another experience in Sao Paulo with a good friend of mine, a missionary, Jim Peterson at that time, and he took me, this was another occasion, took me to the airport. We got inside, this was in Sao Paulo, and got inside and he said, Gene, I left and they have a name for a mail purse that they carry in Sao Paulo, had all of his documents in it, passports, credit cards, everything. I left it in the taxi. And I said, well, Jim, let's pray about it. They're going to return. He looked at me as if I were crazy. You don't understand. But I remember we just prayed. I said, Lord, help that taxi driver to return it. Came to Dallas 24 hours later. Jim called. He said, Gene, you're not going to believe it. The taxi driver turned it in to the lost and found. And I went to the lost and found, and not one thing was missing, which was a miracle in itself. And he got it back. Is God interested in things like that? Yes, he is. Because, as Paul said, don't be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, let your requests be made known to God. So let me restate that principle. The power of prayer. When we encounter challenges that seem insurmountable, we are to pray and ask God for his power to do what is right.